Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on central bank digital currencies and privacy. I'm here today with Johannes, and Johannes and myself will introduce you today to a project we have started together with a couple of colleagues on the topic central bank digital currencies and the support for Cashlike, or with the support for Cashlike Privacy. And before telling you more about our project, I would like to start with a short introductory round, of course, with Johannes, but also with our other co-authors, which are also part of that project. So maybe, Johannes, why don't you start maybe introducing yourself and some of our colleagues?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Johannes. I'm a PhD student at the University of Bayreuth and a researcher at the Fraunhofer Institute for Applied Information Technology. I started my PhD around 3 years ago on the topic of blockchain technology, and since then I've mainly conducted research on privacy and scalability challenges and how to overcome them in blockchain applications. And so in this context, I've looked a lot into digital identities and cryptographic technologies that can help to mitigate these problems. And among others, I experimented with zero-knowledge proofs. And so this is also one of the main reasons why we are using zero-knowledge proofs in our CBDC concept. So Alex and I, we have not developed these ideas on our own. So basically, we have had fruitful discussions in a group of interdisciplinary researchers. There are two further colleagues from my institute, namely Matthias and Benjamin. Matthias has a background in computer science, and he is starting his PhD right now on the topic of digital identities and zero-knowledge proofs. And Benjamin has a background in finance, and he has been pursuing his PhD for, I think, 1.5 years now. And he's basically building the bridge between the more technology-affiliated people in our team, which is Matthias and I, and the more econ-oriented people in our team, who are Jonas and Alex. And so maybe now is a good time for Alex to introduce himself.
Yes, so happy to take over now for the econ guys here in this team. So let's maybe start with myself. I'm Alexander Bechtel. I have done a PhD at the University of St. Gallen in finance and monetary economics. Have spent some time at the European Central Bank as an external consultant. I've also spent some time at Stanford University doing research. And now since a bit more than 1 year, I am at Deutsche Bank, and there I'm in the strategy department of the corporate bank and responsible for anything related to digital assets and currencies and blockchain. And the second econ and finance expert in our team is Jonas Groß. He is currently doing a PhD at the University of St. Gallen. He's an expert on central bank digital currencies as well, has written 1 or 2 papers on that topic. And as Johannes said, together with myself, we are kind of the economics / monetary theory front in this team. Yeah, so as you can see, quite an interdisciplinary team, which is, I think, also very important for this subject, because there are several things coming together in this paper that we have published a couple of weeks ago. I will put a link to our paper into the show notes, but Johannes and I will try to walk you through the paper and give you a bit of an intuition of what we are doing over the next, I would say, about 30 minutes. So let's maybe start with a motivation. So as you might know, as many of you I'm sure know, central bank digital currencies are currently a hot topic. According to the Bank for International Settlements, around 86% of the central bank worldwide are working on central bank digital currencies. Some are rather doing research or are still in a research phase. Others, such as, for instance, the Chinese central bank, is already actively testing and doing experiments with its central bank digital currencies. And others, for instance, the Bahamas, have already issued a central bank digital currencies. Nevertheless, most of the central banks are still kind of in a research phase, and there are a lot of debates going on, of course, about how such a central bank digital currency should look like, which use cases it should address, etc., etc. And one very important discussion are, of course, the design dimensions of such a CBDC. Which characteristics should it have? And a very crucial design dimension is the degree of privacy of the transactions which such a CBDC. So will I be able to make transactions that allow me to preserve full privacy when using a CBDC? I mean, today, if you look around, most of the or all of the digital transactions we usually do with our money that's sitting in our bank accounts are usually transparent transactions. So the bank always knows who we are, and the bank actually have to know who the receivers of our transactions are. So these transactions are transparent, so to say. Then we have now newer things such as Bitcoin, which are pseudonymous. So it's not fully private, but also not fully transparent. There are so basically IDs which you can follow and which you can observe, but the IDs are not necessarily linked to real world identities. And then, of course, you have ways of doing completely anonymous transactions. We have a very convenient way of doing this with cash. So cash payments are usually fully transparent. But there are also digital ways of doing fully transparent payments. And these also come from the area of cryptocurrencies. And there is one famous one that is called Zcash. Another one is called Monero. And they basically allow you to do fully private digital payments. So this let's say, issue of making digital payments fully private has been solved quite some time ago. So it's not an issue to make fully anonymous digital payments. However, what is an issue is to make fully anonymous digital payments that are at the same time regulatory compliant. Because what's of course happening or what's of course existing are regulations that try to take care of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. And fully anonymous transactions are of course not in line with these regulations. And basically, that's exactly what we are trying to address and solve in our paper. When you look into the literature, in particular on central bank digital currencies, there seems to be kind of a general opinion flowing around that it's more or less impossible to bring together true anonymity and at the same time regulatory compliance, because if you don't know where the money comes from and where it's flowing to, you cannot be regulatory compliant. And basically in our paper, we aim at bringing these two worlds together, and we are making a very specific proposal that we have also at least partially already coded of how to bring basically these two worlds together and create a CBDC that at the same time supports cash-like privacy, so true anonymity, but on the other hand, also allows us to be regulatory compliant. And how exactly we do that, this is of course something we want to show you over the next couple of slides. Maybe to give you already an intuition, the way we do this is by implementing thresholds, because this is usually what's done in these anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing regulation, that they say up to a certain threshold, you are allowed to do fully anonymous payments. And as soon as you cross this threshold, you have to basically give your credentials and note down your personal data. And by using, and Johannes has mentioned that already, so-called zero knowledge proofs, we are able basically to make this exact adherence to limits possible in a digital world. And I mean, what I've said is also summarized on this slide again. So our goal is really to have full privacy for a central bank digital currency. And maybe to add one point to this, what we mean by full privacy, we really mean cash-like privacy. So no one is able to have an insight into your data. So it's impossible to know who has sent the amount, how high the amount of the payment is, etc., etc. What we do not mean with privacy is that the central bank collects the data but deletes it after 2 weeks, for instance. So we are really talking here about true anonymity or full privacy, as we call it in the paper. And as I've said, the way we achieve this while at the same time remaining regulatory compliant is by using cryptography, in particular zero knowledge proofs, which basically enables us to do this without having to trust a third party, such as a bank or a central bank, that the data is being deleted after 2 weeks, because we never share data with anyone in our approach. Yeah, Johannes, maybe handing over to you for a second. Maybe you can give us an intuition of how we are able basically to reach exactly that goal by using zero-knowledge proofs, and what kind of characteristic and capabilities zero-knowledge proofs bring us in order to basically bring these two worlds together that I've just described.
Sure, yeah. Maybe I briefly also give another perspective on the motivation, because so Alex has mentioned basically the motivation for looking at CBDC and privacy. But maybe I want to add, so why do we look particularly into privacy? So there are a lot of other interesting design dimensions that need to be considered. What's special about privacy is maybe that it is one of the design dimensions that are probably not pursued by private sector entities. And so this makes it specifically interesting, because we know that typically there is not a lot of incentives for people to pay for getting privacy, but on the other hand, there is a need for privacy that is generally acknowledged in different kinds of constitutional legislation, and also it is known that people expect privacy. For example, there was a consultation in Europe that demonstrated that essentially people thought privacy was more important than even security, which is maybe a bit too much, but yeah, nevertheless, there are a lot of people that value privacy a lot, although they are not willing to pay for it. And we think that this may be a unique opportunity also for central banks to bring or to get market adoption for central bank digital currencies, because the main reason why they issue or want to issue a digital currency is because they are fearing that other types of money may replace their own currency, and therefore their leverage of using monetary policy to keep the value of the currency somewhat as they want, they need people to use it. And so they need a unique value proposition for people to use the currency. And so maybe privacy is one of these things that a central bank can offer, but that private service providers will likely not offer. And so the question is, what does this privacy need to look like? And probably we are not happy with the approach that Alexander briefly mentioned, where the central bank just promises that they will not look into the data, and they hope that people trust this. But this is maybe not such a good idea, because we also know that in politics, sometimes things are promised that they don't hold. And so maybe we should aim for a system that gives privacy by design. This is also more robust against attacks, for example, because if there are valuable data silos, then there is a risk that hackers will have a look into this and try to attack it. And so we want to design a system where by design, sensitive information is not shared with third parties. So the only place where sensitive transaction information is stored is on users' mobile phone, essentially. And so we don't want, since we don't have a trusted third party that collects transaction information and that checks, for example, how much money a user has already transferred in a month, we need to have the users prove on their own that they comply with the regulation that enforces, for example, turnover limits. And so we need some way of users to prove that they comply with the rules of the monetary system in their transactions without sharing this transaction detail with others. And this is exactly where zero-knowledge proofs can be incredibly valuable, because zero-knowledge proofs allow to prove correctness of computations and properties of data without disclosing the data itself or the computation itself. And basically that's the main reason why we are using zero-knowledge proof. So our design is heavily inspired by what Zcash is doing. They use zero-knowledge proofs essentially to prove that no new money is created out of thin air in a transaction without sharing the details of this transaction with the remaining parties, in this case, all other blockchain nodes, which makes privacy even more important because the information is shared with a lot of other parties. And basically we try to extend this approach to not only cover basically rules for the monetary system itself, like constant supply of coins, for example, but we also want to integrate these regulatory constraints, like, for example, only a specific turnover per time period and no transactions higher than a certain threshold. And this is essentially our approach, why we want to extend Zcash to take into account also the regulatory perspective.
Exactly, and how this works in detail, this is what we're going to show you in a couple of slides. Before we do that, we would like to share with you a high-level perspective or high-level overview of what we imagine a future CBDC system to look like. So this is exactly what you see on the following slide. So we have certain sectors in our economy, which you see here on the top. We have the central bank, we have the banking sector, and then we basically have down here the user of the money. And of course, what's missing here on the slide is, of course, we have a full banking sector with its own commercial bank money that's being used, but we left this out for simplicity here and are really focusing on our CBDC system plus cash. So what happens is that the central bank today issues cash. That's exactly the means of payment that we as end users use from the central bank. That's the version or the form of a central bank money we can access as end users. Today, there is no digital form of central bank money that we as end users can use, and that's exactly what a central bank digital currency would be. Now, the main discussions currently revolve around the central bank being an issuer of this money, and then the role of banks being more or less a manager or an intermediary for the end users. And this is what we basically call in our model transparent CBDC accounts. So you would have banks, the banking sector, which you see here, managing the CBDC accounts of end users and giving end users, so retail clients, you and me, access to central bank digital currencies. So it will most likely not be the case that we have a direct app from the ECB that gives us direct access to our account at the ECB without any other intermediary being involved, because the ECB does not have the necessary capabilities and manpower in order to manage a couple of 100 million accounts in the euro area. And this is why banks will take over this role. And this is what you see here, that banks basically maintain these CBDC accounts. And the discussions we are having today is that you probably as an end user are anyway a client of this bank. So you have gone through a KYC process, the bank knows who you are, and you will be able to have a CBDC account, which is fully transparent. And any transactions you do in this CBDC account, maybe to someone else with another transparent CBDC account, will of course also be a fully transparent payment. And we believe that this is a good idea and this should exist, but of course, what these accounts cannot deliver is this privacy that we have in mind. And this is why we basically have the idea to build on top of this or next to this transparent CBDC accounts, also introduce something that we call a privacy pool. And that's basically what you see here in the middle of this page. And now I think what we should do probably, Johannes, is to explain how it works, because I think it's pretty intuitive how it should work when I have an account at my bank that gives me access to a transparent CBDC, right? I can simply take money off my bank account and transfer it on this transparent CBDC account, or I can also pay in cash at the bank and tell the bank, please deposit this money on my transparent CBDC account. What's a bit more tricky is, of course, then to use this privacy pool. So maybe, Johannes, over to you, and maybe you can explain how it's possible to get money into this privacy pool. I mean, we have all this in more detail later, but to give a first impression of where this money can come from and how it works to pay in and pay out money.
Yeah, so maybe, first of all, why is it important to have basically both the transparent side and the private side? I think the main reason why we don't want to abandon the transparent side is, on the one hand, we need to somewhat restrict the amount of transfers that may happen on the private side. And so imagine that at the end of a month, the turnover limit is already basically reached. We don't want to be left not being able to pay anymore. And so we somewhat need to seamlessly switch between the private account and the transparent account, so we can still make the payment, although maybe it's not private anymore then, so we can still do our payments that we want. And so we basically need both. We need the privacy pool to do payments where we value privacy a lot. And for all the other payments, we aim to use the transparent side. And also if the budget of the privacy pool essentially for a month is already surpassed, we also want to go to the transparent side. And so we can...
So Johannes, just what you're basically saying is, since using the privacy pool will be restricted due to AML and CFT regulation, I might only be able to do payments of, let's say, 3,000 euro per month. But if I want to do payments of 4,000 euros, of course, it shouldn't be the case that I can't do any payments anymore with the CBDC. So I would simply have to use then my transparent CBDC in order to do these payments, since I'm fully transparent and fully KYC'd on this transparent side.
Exactly, yeah. And so conveniently, we can also use these transparent CBDC accounts to get money into our private CBDC accounts. And so what we essentially can do in order to bootstrap our private CBDC account and to get money into it, either we receive a private transaction in the private CBDC account, of course, but somebody needs to get money into the private CBDC account. And the idea is to just decrease my balance on the transparent side and in turn to increase my balance on the private side. And so essentially, as basically in any payment, I have a transaction and a counter transaction that in total, they don't change total supply, but I can transfer money from my transparent account into my private account and vice versa. So we can have deposits and withdrawals, and essentially then the payment service provider that maintains the transparent CBDC account is also somewhat basically the entity that ensures that we also have access to the private CBDC account, because without them, we cannot get any money inside and outside this privacy pool. There's also another funny alternative.
Yeah, maybe that's what we call a semi-private transfer, right? Because of course your bank knows who you are and your bank sees that you are actually transferring money into the privacy pool. And so one part of this transaction is transparent, and the other part then ends up in the privacy pool, which is not transparent anymore. Maybe, Johannes, you can say one word about what exactly we know in this first step, right? Transferring something into the privacy pool. What does the bank then know about my money or not in the privacy pool?
So essentially, I mean, I could imagine just depositing and withdrawing. Then essentially it's the same person or the account of the same person, both in the transparent CBDC account and on the private side. But the bank doesn't really know for sure that it's the same person that is receiving the money inside the privacy pool. So essentially, the bank can observe that on the transparent side, obviously, the identity of the person that owns the account and whose account balance is then decreased is, of course, visible. The bank also sees how much money is transferred because they know how the balance changes on the transparent side. And so, of course, they also know what happens in the privacy pool regarding the balance change, because the total supply of money has to be constant, but the bank doesn't see who receives the payment inside the privacy pool. So basically we have one-sided privacy, and since the amount of the transaction is the same in both transactions involved, essentially, it also knows the amount. And so this is different for payments inside the privacy pool, where both the sender and the receiver's accounts are living inside the privacy pool. In this case, nobody, neither the central bank nor a payment service provider, learns anything about the two involved identities, and they also don't learn the amount that is being transferred. So basically, this is what we consider full privacy, like in cash. Beyond the two participants involved in the transaction, nobody knows what's going on. And there's basically just an abstract record. Well, something happened. There was a payment between two people with some amount of money. So this is essentially what all the other people learn. And what's maybe also quite funny is a way to convert cash directly into the privacy pool when we have special ATMs that are in some way connected to the central bank. Because then basically the ATM can conduct the counter transaction that in the other case would be done by the payment service provider maintaining the transparent account. So basically the ATM, if it receives a 10 euro note, for example, the ATM can sign that it just received a 10 euro note and send this transaction either directly to the central bank or to me, and I can couple this with a counter transaction that increases my privacy pool account by exactly the same amount. And then in combination, these transactions can be sent to the central bank, and the central bank will agree that this transaction is valid because obviously the same amount of money was received as in the ATM as was added to my privacy pool account. And so we can basically seamlessly switch between cash, the private CBDC account, and the transparent CBDC account.
So now there is one issue which is related to me being a person who not always sticks to the rules, and I like to do illegal things. So my idea would be to open up simply 10 accounts in the privacy pool, being able to basically stick to the limit, which each account individually, but still, of course, having 10 times more possibilities to make transactions. Since this is really easy to do in a digital world, simply to open up several accounts and make a lot of transactions. How are we able to prevent that something like this happens, and that actually everyone can only open one account in this privacy pool?
Yeah, so essentially this is where our digital wallet comes in handy, which we illustrate on the bottom of the slide. So this is also the main issue, basically, why intuitively we need to think about identity in this context, because we need to make sure that one person only has one account. Otherwise, at least turnover limits and balance limits are essentially useless, because I could just open as many accounts as I need to surpass any of these limits. And so the way we want to do this is to derive essentially a privacy pool account from a digital ID that is currently being under consideration, for example, in the EU, but also in individual member states, basically a replacement or additional form of our current ID for the mobile phone that we can store there. And that is then digitally signed, for example, by a federal printer or another authority that is authorized to issue ID cards. And so essentially we can make sure that from one ID card, we can only derive a single valid private CBDC account. So essentially, we never show this ID card per se, but we can prove that we have an ID card for which we have not yet opened an account. And so the central bank can just check whether a specific ID has already a private CBDC account associated with it. And if this is not the case, then a new account can be bootstrapped. And so with this construction, we can make sure that one identity can only open one account. Of course, there are also other considerations that we need to consider, because maybe even though every person can just open one account, I may have opportunities to collect other persons' accounts and use them. So this is what we will probably discuss later on, how we can mitigate this. And the ID card also plays a central role here, because I can assume that people don't want to give away their ID card that they need for using the privacy pool, because on the one hand, I need my ID card from time to time. The more useful it is, the less likely it is that I pass it on. And on the other hand, people can do, for example, criminal activities with your ID card if you pass it on. And so if you give your ID card to people who want to use it for maintaining a lot of accounts, which is obviously an illegal action, then probably I shouldn't give them my ID card, because maybe they want to do other illegal activities in my name. And so this is sometimes called all or nothing transferability, and this comes in quite handy for us, because this gives us quite good guarantees that people are unlikely to pass on their ID card and therefore also their access to the privacy pool.
And maybe one thing to add here, while it's the most elegant way to use a digital ID, we all know that there is no official digital ID existing yet today. So I think it's important to mention that our approach here doesn't rely on a digital ID. So there are, of course, other ways of ensuring that only one account per person can be opened in this privacy pool. So you could also imagine that simply banks take over, and that banks, for instance, share one database where they record all the accounts of their clients that have been opened, and then it's of course more of a manual process and a coordination issue that would have to be solved among banks, or also could also be by the central bank. So more additional manual work. So this is why digital ID is the most elegant one, but there are other ways of solving this issue, so to say.
Yeah, the main important thing here to bear in mind is that the anonymity of the onboarding process is not required for the anonymity of the later transactions. So even if the central bank learned who is currently registering an account, they will not be able to correlate any later transaction with this account opening. So this is, otherwise it would just be pseudonymization, which is always risky when you have big data at hand, because you can typically correlate it to people. We have real anonymization, as Zcash does, for example, which means that this threat is not there. So maybe the solution with banks as issuing basically the access credentials to the private CBDC account is a good intermediary solution, but probably it cannot give us a level of authenticity as high as, for example, associated with the digital ID, because the more rights and permissions are contained basically in what is necessary to use the privacy pool, the lower is the risk that people pass it on. And so if I have an exclusive credential just for using the privacy pool, there is a higher probability that people will give it to other people.
Okay, so I believe we are probably almost already half an hour in, and we said we will use half an hour, but I think that's not an issue. Let me give you maybe a quick outlook on what's coming next. Well, what we are doing now is we go a bit more into detail when it comes to the technology part. And so first with some general motivational slides, what we mean by and how we use CKPs and what that means and how we are related to Zcash. And then we will show you each individual of these transactions. So how a semi-private transaction works, how a fully private transaction works, and also how this onboarding for clients works or users works using a digital ID. So just for you to know what's down the road, I will, of course, in the end also, when you watch this on YouTube, insert a section so you can also jump around a bit. Okay, Johannes, so let's dive a bit deeper into the technology. Yeah, over to you. Hardware versus software based, I think, is a very important message we need to convey, because there are already solutions for this issue out there, but they are mainly hardware based, and this has some trade-offs.
Yeah, right. So essentially, for example, the CBDC system that has been started on the Bahamas is a hardware-based system. We also know hardware-based system from electronic, what is it called, Alex? I'm not sure what the English term is for them. So Geldkarte.
Yeah, I don't know, like a money card, something like this.
So this is already being used, and it's also working. And one of the big advantages is that it's offline capable. So essentially, you can put two of these cards or two smartphones that would support such a system next to each other, and they can securely interact and do a transaction. And essentially, the correctness of the transaction that is happening is ensured by the design of the hardware. So the chip only allows for specific operations that comply with the rules of the monetary system. And so it's typically assumed that it's very difficult to manipulate this chip to do other transactions that are not allowed in the system. So, for example, something that we might know is, for example, the Intel SGX that's running on a lot of Intel chips in our computers that ensure that specific operations are conducted correctly. And so this is a very nice idea. It's offline capable. In principle, this is also very private, because everything is only happen locally. You do not need to send any evidence of the transactions that are happening to a trusted third party. But the problem is that this approach is quite risky, because so far people have not been successful securing these chips against any type of attacks. And so since I have this chip in my hands, I can, for example, do electronic measurements and try to manipulate what the chip is doing. or I can try to crack some key that is being used by the manufacturer for basically proving that what the chip is doing is correct. So this is called remote attestation. And if this is essentially a single point of failure, because if somebody gets their hands onto this key, then they can fake what is happening inside the chip. And so this is why basically these chips need some kind of risk management, which means that if one of these chips would be compromised by an attacker, they could use this chip to create as much money as they would like. And if this is fully anonymous, then that's difficult because you will never find the chip that is responsible or that has been hacked. And so you need to wrap some kind of risk management around it. And typically this involves identifying the people who are using this chip. And this is bad for our initial idea of providing full privacy, because if we know who is transacting at which time, maybe even the amount of money that has been transacted already this month, that's not favorable for what we want to achieve. So in principle, the idea would be great if these 100% secure chips would really exist, and this would probably be the greatest approach that we have. However, as we don't have this, we are looking for substitutes of this. And so one substitute that by experience seems to be more robust than a chip is cryptography itself, because you can typically, based on a few established assumptions, prove that things work. And so this is what the approach that we are pursuing. We are trying to prove that what we do locally in terms of transactions and maintaining our account is correct, but we don't do the proof with remote attestation and a chip that only allows for certain operations, but we prove using cryptography that what we are doing is correct. And this is exactly basically what zero knowledge proofs have been built for. They allow to prove that certain operations have been conducted correctly without the need to reveal all the information, all the computations that have been done. And so this is also how Zcash is using cryptography. They are using zero knowledge proofs to prove that no money is created out of thin air. And we additionally use it to prove that all of the rules, regulatory rules in the transaction have been accounted for. And so if you please move on to the next slide. Essentially, we first have had a look at Zcash because it's a really great innovation. It's already working and it already satisfies a lot of the things that we want to achieve, like full privacy. And we try to find, so what's missing in order to get regulatory rules inside the system. And so with the design of Zcash, a few components would be readily available. So for example, to impose per transaction limits on the amount that may be transferred per transaction, this would be really easy to integrate into Zcash, because in every transaction, you prove a bunch of statements, and it would be easy to add another statement that says the amount, I don't disclose what it is, but I prove that it's below a certain threshold that is legally imposed. However, where we have a problem is that Zcash is using a UTXO approach. So this is short for unspent transaction output. This is also the approach that is taken in Bitcoin. Essentially, when I'm spending money, I'm pointing to some money that I previously received and that I have not yet spent. And then I create new coins with the same amount and I give them to somebody else. And while Zcash is explicitly pointing to the old transaction that I received, Zcash is only proving that there has been some transaction that I received and that has not yet been spent. So this is breaking the transaction history, and this is also providing the anonymity part. And this makes it impossible in Zcash to track all the transactions associated with one account. So there is no notion of accounts. There is only a notion of coins or digital banknotes.
It's actually very similar to cash, right? So basically Zcash checks if you want to spend a certain amount. So Zcash takes a look at your wallet. Let's say it's a physical wallet, and it checks, is there enough money in this wallet which you want to spend, right? But Zcash, you have no idea where this money comes from, basically. So
maybe that's the reason why they are putting cash into the name.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah. So it's very difficult to track all the transactions that one party, one identity has conducted, because there is intentionally no way to link them from the outside. And so we would have a hard time proving that, for example, during a month, we have not exceeded a certain limit in terms of turnover. And so this is why we basically assumed that we need an account-based model in order to really funnel all of the transactions associated with one identity into one account so that we have them all together. And then we can do proofs about the maintenance of this account and that all the transactions are being executed correctly and that the turnover that has been documented in this account is not exceeding a certain threshold. And so the fundamental challenge of an account-based system is essentially, it is very difficult to anonymize it because an account is associated with a recurring identity, you would expect. And so we basically merged the approach of Zcash with an account-based system by, so in Zcash, you store hashes of transactions and you prove that you know the pre-image behind this hash and you can compute on it. And what we now do is essentially when we do a transaction, we do not spend an old coin that we received and create new coins, but we spend an old account state that we have, so the previous account state, and we create a new account state. And essentially the transaction that is happening corresponds to the difference in balances for the old and for the new account state. And then we hide this old and new account state also behind a hash as Zcash is doing. So whenever we do a transaction, we prove that we have an old account state in the ledger that's being maintained by the central bank in our approach. And we now commit to a new hash that represents the new account state, and we prove that the difference between the accounts behind these two hashes corresponds to a legitimate operation. So this is essentially our main idea. And for the more technical people, so we are also using this approach of Zcash of commitments and nullifiers, where the nullifiers serve to avoid double spends. So whenever I spend an old account state, I also put some identifier for this old state into the list of nullifiers, so I cannot use it again. And so this is basically already the whole magic. Instead of using commitments and nullifiers to represent old and new coins, we use commitments and nullifiers to represent old account states and new account states, and we link them through zero-knowledge proofs, and then can prove, for example, that our local accounting complies with all the rules of the monetary system, both regulatory rules and non-regulatory rules like constant supply. So this is the main idea that we are pursuing. And so this provides us perfect anonymity because we never link those two, basically the old and the new account state explicitly. We only prove that there is an old account state that we use for creating the new account state. So we get the same anonymity guarantees as Zcash does, but we funnel everything that's happening into the same account and therefore allow for a very comprehensive local accounting.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point. The last two words you said, local accounting, that's exactly what happens. And I think that's nicely shown here on this slide. So on the left-hand side, that's basically what I see or what I store basically on my phone. I of course, personally know my transaction history and I have it stored on my phone, but that's the only place where I've stored it, right? Anything I share with the outside world is only basically these some spend account states, so to say, right? So the central bank, which is of course in the maintaining the whole ledger. So the central bank, of course, has full control, as Johannes said, over the total money supply. But that's one of the very few things the central bank sees here, right? It does not see, as you see here on the right-hand side, who has spent this money. It just sees money has been spent, and it has been spent according to the rules I have defined. And that's the only thing a central bank ultimately needs to know, right? It needs to know, has someone spent less than threshold X, which I have imposed or regulators have imposed for AML reasons, for instance. And if someone can prove to me that they have stick to these rules, there's nothing more I need to know. I mean, what do I earn by knowing that person X has spent something on product Y or sent money to person C? That's nothing I am as a central bank I'm interested in.
So essentially, the central bank only sees cryptographic gibberish that proves that people complied with the rules. And for these semi-private transactions that transfer money between the private side and the transparent side, they additionally see the amount that is being transferred because they see it on the transparent side, so they also know what it needs to be on the private side. But that's basically it.
Yeah, so then let's maybe go a bit more into detail about these semi-private, private transactions, etc. And I think the first important thing we need to explain in a bit more detail is how do I, as an onboard, as a user, onboard to this privacy pool? How does this work? And that's exactly what's shown on this slide, Johannes.
Yeah, so essentially we assume that people have a digital ID on their mobile phone already. So basically, there are already digital versions, for example, in Germany of the ID card, because there is a digital certificate in the key pair being stored on our physical ID card. And there are ways to transfer this onto a mobile phone already. We just pimped that up by adding a bit, basically another approach of digital signatures on such an ID card that supports cooler cryptographic operations. So we didn't work with today's ID cards, but we worked with a functional alternative that just supports a bit of a different cryptography. And so we can essentially use this now together with zero knowledge proofs to send a proof to the central bank that we own a digital ID that has not yet registered on the privacy pool. And essentially we do this by deriving a deterministic identifier from this ID card, for example, a hash of a bunch of attributes, and a proof that this ID card was truly signed, for example, by the federal printer, it is not yet revoked, it is not yet expired. And then the central bank can basically check the proof that this identifier was created according to the rules deterministically from a valid ID card. They can check whether such an ID has already registered, and if it has not yet registered, they essentially write a new hash to the ledger that represents my account bound to my ID card, and with a bunch of zeros for initial turnover, initial balance, and so on. So I initialized now a new account. And so in the future, I can basically refer to this initial account state, which is my previous account state, and then say, okay, I spent this old account state. And for example, now in the first transaction, I want to deposit money from the transparent side onto the private side. And so what I essentially do in this case.
So that's Alex, this slide, right?
Right, yeah. So what happens there is essentially I now propose an update, which means that I send a message to the central bank that says, I hereby prove that I have an old account state and I have a new proposal, a hash for that represents my new account state. And I want to increase my balance by, say, 50 euros. And so I prove that the difference between the balance of the old account that I'm referring to, and which I'm not showing, and the new account, which I'm not showing, but I'm just sending its hash, is 50 euros. And I have a counter transaction, for example, signed by my bank that reduces my transparent, my balance on the transparent side by the same 50 euros. And so basically I have these two kinds of receipts, one with a zero knowledge proof, one just with a signature of my payment service provider. I bundle them and I send them to the central bank. And so the central bank can now prove, well, the amount of money deposited on the privacy side is the same as the amount of money subtracted on the transparent side. All of the turnover, balance, per transaction limits on the privacy pool account that is being considered are complied with. So no violations of the regulatory rules. And so the central bank now can just say, well, okay, so the individual update of the privacy pool account is legitimate, and in combination with the receipt for the privacy on the transparent side is also okay. So I update my ledger and I add basically this new hash for the new account state and the nullifier corresponding to the old account state that I spent. And so this is basically how a deposit works. On the other way around, it would be a withdrawal. So decreasing the balance on the private side. Of course, we need to prove that the balance is then still positive. And on the transparent side, we can accordingly increase our balance. We can also use it to transfer the money to somebody else. So for example, when I'm going into the supermarket maybe it's important for me to have the transaction in a private way. Maybe I bought something embarrassing. But on the other hand, the supermarket probably doesn't have a need to be fully private. So they maybe have just a transparent account. Probably the limits that we want to impose on the privacy side are also either too low for the supermarket for being practical, or we don't want to have specifically high limits for supermarkets. So they would probably be fine with receiving the money on the transparent side. And so my payment will basically constitute also a proof that I decreased my balance in the privacy pool by some amount, and the supermarket would just get a signature from their bank that their balance has been increased. And so this would also represent a valid transaction. In a similar way, as explained in the beginning, it would work for transferring cash onto the privacy pool or withdrawing from the privacy pool to get cash. So in this case, the ATM would basically replace what the payment service provider is doing.
Yeah, and I think this example with the merchant or the supermarket was really important, but because I could imagine this might be one of the main use cases, right? That I use my private CBDC in order to purchase something from a supermarket, from I don't know, even on the internet, right? I can now basically purchase my medicine on the internet while still remaining more or less private. And for the merchants, it might be more sensible to stay on the transparent side. Of course, it would technically be possible to have merchant accounts also in the privacy pool, but of course, merchants have have to stick to some other regulatory and tax requirements, or have to fulfill regulatory and tax requirements, such that it's probably more sensible for most cases to have the merchants on the transparent side. And
maybe in this place, it's also important to emphasize that there are alternative solutions to ours that are very well suitable for achieving exactly this task. So basically anonymous payment, but transparent receiving of payments. So one example, for example, basically the first approach to doing this was also already developed in the 80s by David Chaum. And so recently a team of Swiss researchers has proposed a central bank digital currency that's also using the same cryptography. It has the great benefit that the cryptography is not as complex and therefore also less error prone. But the challenge that they have is that on the one hand, they cannot provide fully private payments, which was one of the essential goals that we have, for example, pocket money and other payments where both sides want to be private. And on the other hand, for example, if now at a later time, I want to get a refund from the supermarket because I don't like the product, for example, then this time it would need to be the supermarket that's private and I need to receive the money in a transparent way, which is probably not the intention. So it would be better if in this case, the payer would be private and the receiver would be anonymous. And so we basically have the flexibility to support all these kinds of payments.
Yeah, and it's called a GNU-Taler, so the paper has another name, but I will link the paper down in the show notes, and the concept is called the GNU-Taler, and it's definitely something exciting, and you should take a look at if you're interested into that topic. So Johannes, let's maybe do the last thing, because that's of course the most interesting stuff for those who want to do the fully private payments. So this is now payments within the privacy pool from one private account to another private account.
Yeah, and so essentially from a conceptual perspective, this is not very different from the things described previously. The only difference is that now basically both update proposals are living inside the privacy pool. And that also means that both parties that want to do a transaction need to be actively involved in the transaction. So they both basically need to propose an update of their account, meaning they need to point or they need to prove that they have an old account state that has not yet been spent, and they need to propose a new account state or a hash thereof that they want to create. And then both parties individually prove that they comply with all the limits. And then basically they create a joint proof that proves that the amount of money that one of them receives is exactly the same as the amount of money that the other party loses balance-wise. And so basically they create these individual proofs, they link them, and they send them to the central bank. The central bank then checks both proofs individually and whether they fit together. And if this happens, then basically the hashes corresponding to the accounts can be settled on the ledger.
And actually, this transaction here happening in the in the privacy pool allowed me to kind of cross the hurdle when I started looking into zero knowledge proofs and understanding how this actually works and what's at the heart of our proposal. So let me maybe highlight this again. So making a payment in this privacy pool is really different from making a payment today when you make a payment through your bank account, for instance, because what happens there is always you go to your bank and you inform your bank you want to make a payment. And then it's the bank which basically sends a message to the receiving bank, right? And the two banks exchange messages, and they are independently of each other reconciliating their databases and balances. So this is how payments work today. And here the concept is really different, because you're not informing anyone that you want to do a payment, and of course giving them the amount and who you are and where you want to send it to, but you're simply sending them a proof that you stick to the rules, and you're sending them here now a joint proof with your receiver. So if you are the sender, you're basically jointly with the receiver of your money sending a proof, proving that whatever was reduced from your account has been added to the account of the sender, plus the amount you have sent was below the threshold that is predefined, plus you are still sticking to the transaction volume that you may be able to sum up over a month, like your turnover limit. So these, maybe what you could also add to your proof is that you are a German citizen, right? All these kinds of things could be added to that proof, and you simply prove to the central bank that you stick to these rules. But the only thing the central bank sees is a certain amount has been reduced from one random account, and another, the very same amount has been added to another account, and all these other rules I've just mentioned have been followed.
Right, and so one of these rules, we briefly discussed this before, would probably also involving the possession, a proof of possession of a valid ID card, either in every transaction or maybe in every second transaction or maybe in out of 5 transactions. So you can think of different basically levels of assurance that you want to have, but maybe it's advisable to involve proofs of possession of a valid ID card that has not yet been revoked and that is not expired and so on, to really increase the level of authenticity so that people cannot pass on their accounts without a problem.
Okay, I think that's a good point to move on to the last point here of our discussion today, which is a couple of things we have done in the paper, or in particular one important thing. We have done a lot of interviews. So anything we have presented to you today has been shown to more than 40 experts basically around the world, from central banks, from universities with different backgrounds. So we had technical experts, we had legal experts, of course we had economists, in particular monetary economists, to which we have presented this. And a lot of what you have seen is now also the result of these interviews. So we started, of course, with I wouldn't say a totally different approach, but of course a lot of these problems we can already address while presenting this to you have been brought up by our interviewees. So maybe at this point, again, a big thank you to everyone who has spent some time giving us feedback. And maybe also a shout out immediately. If you're seeing this presentation, if you've read our paper, we are more than happy to receive your feedback. We are also more than happy to present this to you personally again, asking you some questions, what you think. And so, yeah, this is always welcome and a very integral part of the paper we are writing. Yeah, maybe Johannes, you can summarize a bit the feedback and maybe the discussion points that have been brought up during these interviews.
Yeah, sure. So we already discussed, I think, these limits for businesses and the need for semi-private transactions a bit. So I will not go further into detail there. Also, we often discuss the lack of a digital identity that we need for basically to implement our approach as we proposed it today. So there is a lot of work needed to spread a digital identity among citizens, to make use of it also for anonymous payments. Performance was an often discussed topic because at least the technical experts were aware that zero knowledge proof typically involve a lot of effort computational wise. However, there's a big caveat. So the creation of the proof is very computationally intensive, but the verification of the proof is not computationally expensive. which means that there will not be a bottleneck on the server that essentially maintains the ledger because it just needs to verify proofs. But we need to be aware that basically the computational power of a smartphone, so it is good enough today to create proofs within a few seconds. So for example, Zcash has demonstrated it. But we really need to take care that the statements that we prove don't get overly complex, and there will be a lot of optimization necessary to really create a system with sub-second proving time of smartphones. So there is really, the cryptography is still complex that a smartphone needs to conduct, but we are optimistic that within the next years also an average smartphone will be able to get the speed that we need there.
And maybe the good news is for all the central bankers here, you mentioned it already, that the institution that controls the ledger, which would be the central bank, of course, in this case, has very little necessities to invest into computing power because verifying is very computationally cheap.
Yeah, exactly. So we also often discussed the question whether we need a blockchain or whether we should use a blockchain, because CBDC was heavily inspired from developments in blockchain space. So for simplicity, we started with a centralized system that is not using a blockchain. But basically the reason why zero knowledge proofs have matured so much over the last years is that they are desperately needed on blockchains, because blockchains always have significant privacy and scalability issues, and zero knowledge proofs can address both, because the verification that happens on the blockchain is cheap and the data doesn't need to be revealed. And so essentially by designing a system that gets rid of all the sensitive information by design, because the sensitive information is not stored on the ledger anymore, we have set a good foundation to maybe later on discuss also more decentralized ledgers that then store the transaction hashes and the proofs. So for example, a ledger that's not being maintained by the central bank anymore, but by payment service providers, for example. And so we don't need to care about privacy that much anymore because the data that's stored there is not sensitive. But then we would need to have an eye on the transparent side, because obviously the transparent side is still involving sensitive information. So, but we basically already solved the privacy issues of the privacy pool if at some stage this would need to be decentralized. And of course, we just discussed a lot about risk mitigation. So how can we make sure that people do not pass on their access to the privacy pool? What can we do if there is a bug in the implementation of the zero knowledge proofs, or maybe a mistake in the literature on the cryptography involved with it? Because since the central bank doesn't see what exactly is going on in the privacy pool, it's also more difficult to detect, for example, if somebody could create money out of thin air because they can forge proofs because they found a bug.
Yeah, let's maybe go a bit into detail here, because I think we should be really, and I agree with these 2 bullet points. These are also, in my opinion, the 2 main I mean, we could call it weaknesses of our approach, or at least problems where we need to find a solution, right? One is the money mule, where we say, what happens if someone really collects different accounts and then uses them to make, of course, payments higher than the threshold? Here, Johannes, I think you have already explained what our plan is. Ideally, we link it to a credential, let's say an ID card that can be used for many other things as well, which means I would give away not only my access to the privacy pool, but I would also give away my access to signing a contract when buying a new real estate, for instance, or when, I don't know, whenever I need my ID, right? So it would be probably worth a lot more than just a couple of €100 to give away such a card. And then probably there will be kind of an equilibrium if we say the transaction limit is maybe at €1,000 and you would have to pay me at least €5,000 to give away my ID card, because you can do basically have my whole identity then under control. Then it's a natural basically equilibrium where you couldn't do this money mule business on a scaled basis, at least. So I'm pretty relaxed about this one. What we still need to think about, I think, is the first bullet point here, which says what happens if something goes wrong, right? I mean, I think it's clear that we are relying here on the functioning of the cryptography. And I think that's nothing special, because a lot of things in our economy rely on the functioning of cryptography. So that's nothing special. But you mentioned this, Johannes. What's maybe a bit different here in our case is that we might not realize if someone has broken the cryptography, right? We might only realize it after, I don't know, more money is paid out of the privacy pool than has ever been paid in, right? This is, of course, a way we could realize this. But if anything that happens only in the privacy pool, this is a bit of an issue. So we need to think about contingency plans or emergency plans, how we could maybe control in certain time intervals if everything is still working as planned. So, Johannes, I would also be interested in your opinion of what you think are the best solutions to this issue, and maybe also a shout out to anyone seeing this. If you have good ideas how to address this, we would be very happy to receive your feedback.
Yeah, so I think one potential approach is certainly basically clearing the privacy pool from time to time and to count whether the amount of money that the total system has is still the same as has been issued by the central bank. This is, of course, a bit inconvenient, because the more frequently you basically eliminate the privacy pool and bootstrap it again, the less privacy you have, because people will see your balance from time to time. On the other hand, some of the more technical people that we talked with were quite relaxed also in this topic, because they said, well, it's so much easier to forge physical cash and physical bank notes than basically, so not a lot of criminals are cryptography experts that would try to find a bug in a publication or in an implementation. And there seem to be quite good ways to formally audit also implementations that basically make quite sure that such a fundamental bug is not there. And if, on the other hand, there are quite new zero-knowledge proofs that don't need a lot of cryptographic assumptions, and so if one of these assumptions is broken, then basically all the security on the web that we have today would also be broken. So again, there would be other opportunities for criminals to get a lot of money. So this is somewhat the results that we got from the more technical people, but we certainly will try to dig into this deeper and find other creative solutions that can have some kind of risk mitigation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you alluded to, we are relying here mainly on cryptography that's decades old, right, and has been tested and retested over decades. And there is a large literature on that, and many other parts of our society are also relying on this cryptography already. Okay, Johannes, let's maybe finish up with the next steps. So where are we? What are we doing right now? And what are the next steps? We have, a couple of weeks ago, published this working paper. Now we were all on holiday for some time, and now we reconvened a couple of days ago. And so what are the plans going forward?
So we are, of course, trying to define the project, potentially have another few interviews, again, with people from more technical side to discuss all of our assumptions on the security, and also practitioners who may be interested to learn more about it because they can imagine using it. We will also try to improve the prototype that we have developed. So we have already implemented a few of the zero-knowledge proofs in our system. And so we are currently working on getting the proof of an identity card for bootstrapping the account. And so in the end, we certainly want to have all three basic transactions, so the fully private ones, the semi-private ones, and the onboarding, to have a nice CLI-based demonstration, essentially. So for the time being, building, for example, a wallet and a fully functional prototypical system is beyond our scope. So we are not aiming for this right now, but at least we want to implement the basic functionalities of the system, and we have partially already done so. And there is also a open source repository that Alex can certainly link in the show notes. And yeah, besides that, I think our main goal is spreading the thought. So a lot of people also, when reading publications on CBDC, are not aware that bridging compliance and privacy is possible with fancy cryptography like zero-knowledge proofs. And so we really want to get this thought into the world, because if people and decision makers are told that, well, privacy is impossible, if you want to get control on compliance, they will probably accept this. But if they know that there are ways to get both, then there is a lot of good reasons to use the system that gives you both, although it's a bit more complex than the other approaches.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to share all the necessary documents down in the show notes. So feel free to have a look there. We, as I said, welcome very much any comments. So you can also directly comment on that video. Of course, we will make sure that we answer any questions you have. And I mean, if you have worked on a similar topic as well, please feel free to get in touch with us. We have been contacted by a couple of central banks who are interested in the topic as well. Of course, we are very happy to share this idea. Even though we announced 30 minutes, I think it was more like 60 minutes now. So thanks a lot for everyone sticking until the end. And yeah, then looking forward to receiving your comments, and we will try to keep you up to date on anything that's happening on this project. And of course, Johannes, thanks a lot to you for coming by and walking us in particular through the more technical details of the whole project.
It was a pleasure. Thanks as well. And to the listeners, watchers, thanks for having a look.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.